Hello and welcome to part 2 of my account of the great love story between Susette Gontard and the poet Friedrich Hölderlin. If you haven't had a chance yet to check out part 1, you can either follow the link that is shown above, or you can use the one in the video description. At the end of part 1, we left off with the heated argument between Hölderlin and Susette's husband, which ultimately ended with Susette asking Hölderlin to leave. Furious, Hölderlin did exactly that. Early next morning, he left the house without saying goodbye to anyone, not even Susette. In fact, nobody knew he had left until later in the day. And this is where we pick up our story. As soon as Susette realized that he was really gone, she immediately regretted that in the heat of the moment she had asked him to leave on impulse. In one of her letters to him, she wrote, quote, "I have often regretted advising you to leave immediately. I still don't understand what feeling compelled me to urge you so insistently, but I think it was the fear of the full intensity of our love, which became too loud inside me when this enormous rift occurred." End quote. It is said that she threatened to leave her husband, but in the end she didn't have the courage to do so. All that was left was an empty house in which she now felt even more lonely and unhappy than before. Before, Hölderlin had stepped into her life and filled her house with warmth and love and life. Suddenly, the house seemed to her like a huge coffin in which she was buried. She wrote, quote, "Now that you are gone, everything around me and inside me feels desolate and empty. When I come home, it is no longer the same as it used to be. Before, I felt so comfortable being close to you again. But now, it feels like stepping into a large box which imprisons me." End quote. A great melancholic despondency came over her. She would go to bed very early, together with her children. And she started seeing Hölderlin everywhere. Under her window, behind a tree or some bushes, across the street or in the glow of a street lantern. Once she almost fainted because she thought she had seen him on the street whilst she was in the company of friends. She immediately ran into her room and looked out of the window to see if he was there, but it was just an illusion. In one of her letters to him, she describes a touching scene. She recounts how, shortly after his departure, she went to his room and found some of his belongings that he had left behind, and how she has kept them as mementos of him. She wrote, quote, "2 days after you left, I went back to your room to have a good cry and collect some of your cherished belongings. I unlocked your desk and found a few pieces of paper, some sealing wax, a small white button, and a hard piece of brown bread. I carried these items with me for a long time, like relics." End quote. But she was not the only one who suffered. Her son, too, missed Hölderlin terribly, because he had grown very fond of him. And when he wrote a letter to him and his father found out about it, he forbade him from having any further contact with Hölderlin. In the period that followed, Susette refused any attention her husband tried to show her. She did not accept gifts from him and deliberately rejected all luxury and all cheerful pleasures and diversions. As she wrote, quote, "From the one who did not spare the heart of my heart, even the smallest favor must be like poison to me. I prefer this pride and this feeling to all the riches of the world." End quote. And what about Hölderlin? After he had left the Gontards, he had moved to a nearby town called Homburg. He deliberately chose this place because he had friends there and because he could stay close to Susette this way. Only about 20 miles separated the two lovers from each other. And I wonder how many times they must have stood at their windows, looking in the direction of either Frankfurt or Homburg, and thought to themselves, so near and yet so far. Soon after, she began to devise ways in which they could stay in touch. And it seems like she took the lead in this regard, because in her letters she repeatedly presented him with new plans and ideas that she had come up with. Sometimes it was with the help of friends and acquaintances that they would exchange letters. Sometimes they would meet in secret and exchange them themselves. At first they were rather careless, and Hölderlin even sneaked into the house a few times, using a back entrance and creeping up the stairs into her room. As she wrote, quote, "Come this afternoon at 3:15. Walk without fear through the back door, which is always open, and run lightly and quickly up the stairs as usual. The door to my room by the stairs will already be open for you. The children will be studying in the blue room at that time and won't be able to see you if you walk close to the wall. Wilhelmine will stay with Marley in the living room and hopefully will be able to talk undisturbed for about an hour." End quote. But this backfired quickly because on one of those occasions Hölderlin was seen by one of the staff. Fortunately, there were no severe consequences for any of them. But this meant that they had to come up with other ideas. Susette suggested meeting at the theater, so that even if they couldn't talk to each other, they could at least see each other from afar. But this too had to be scrapped after a few times, because Susette feared that people would start to wonder about her frequent visits to the theater, which apparently was quite uncharacteristic of her, especially since most of the plays must have been pretty bad. So they decided to only meet on certain days of the month. Susette devised an ingenious system so that they would not miss each other and would not be detected. Hölderlin was to come every first Thursday of the month, weather permitting, and position himself near the house at a certain time so that he could keep an eye on her window. Susette would give him a signal, either by moving the curtains or hanging out a white piece of cloth, to let him know whether the coast was clear or whether it was too dangerous. If the coast was clear, they would meet near the house where no one could see them, hidden by bushes and trees. She wrote, quote, "And when the clock strikes 10, you will appear at the low hedge, near the poplar trees. I will then go to my window and we can see each other. As a sign, put your stick over your shoulder. I will use a white cloth. If I close the window after a few minutes, it is a sign that I'm coming down. But if I don't, I must not dare. When I come, you go to the beginning of the driveway, not far from the small arbor. The arbor hides me, and you can make sure that no one is coming from either side, so that we can have enough time to exchange our letters through the hedge." End quote. These kinds of meetings could not have lasted more than a couple of minutes. I suppose most times they had just enough time to pass their letters through the hedgerow and catch a short glimpse of each other, or hold hands for just one moment. It sounds incredibly romantic, but it must have been very hectic and nerve-wracking, and, I'm sure, quite unsatisfactory for both of them. Especially since there were constant complications. For example, she had agreed with him that he should only come on the first Thursday of the month if the weather was good enough. But Frankfurt and Homburg were far enough apart from each other that the weather was sometimes different in each place. So it happened more than once that either Susette stood at her window without him coming, or Hölderlin stood in front of a closed window, having made the long journey from Homburg for nothing. And one must remember that each time he walked the distance from Homburg to Frankfurt on foot. That meant several hours of walking in total. And if the weather didn't thwart their plans, then it was curious neighbors they had to be wary of. She wrote, quote, "To make sure that we both get our letters, you can come back to the corner at 11 o'clock, but I advise to never linger there for too long, because there is a sick neighbor upstairs who is very bored." End quote. For 1.5 years they kept up this routine, and had to contend with a wide variety of obstacles and coincidences that determined their fate. Often, when the danger was too great, they could only wave silently to each other. During the summer, Susette always stayed with her family at a country estate outside of Frankfurt. But even there, meetings were difficult, and Hölderlin could only stay for a short while. But despite all the difficulties, they regularly kept writing to each other. It's a great shame that almost none of the letters Hölderlin wrote to Susette have survived. There are only 2 drafts and 1 fragment that have been found among his papers. Although in one of her letters she mentions that she had neatly collected all his letters and compiled them like a book. She wrote, quote, "I have compiled all your letters into a book, and if I don't hear from you for a long time, I will read it and think, it's still like it was back then." End quote. But given that none of Hölderlin's letters to Susette have survived, we must assume that they were destroyed, either by Susette herself or, more likely, by her husband after her death. All we have are 17 letters from Susette. Hölderlin kept them close at all times, and took them wherever he went. Even when he left Germany and went abroad, he took her letters with him. He hid them in a secret compartment in his suitcase. And reading through these few letters that have survived, we get to hear touching little anecdotes that give us a very vivid picture of Susette's everyday life, and of her feelings and her relationship with Hölderlin. For example, in one of them, she told Hölderlin about a dress that her brother gave to her. She said that it was, quote, "just to your taste, purple and white. I received it on the day you were last here with me, and so it's also a dear memento to me. I'll be happy to wear it." End quote. Another time, when she was on a small vacation with some friends, she also recorded her impressions for Hölderlin. When she traveled to Kassel, one of the destinations she had previously been to with Hölderlin, she visited all of her favorite places that reminded her of him and their time together. But these romantic musings and sentiments notwithstanding, there is also a growing sense of dread in her letters. Susette became increasingly anxious and cautious. She was more and more afraid that they might get caught. She wrote, quote, "I'm so anxious. I always think we'll be exposed, and the obstacles, which are already almost impossible to overcome, will multiply even further." End quote. And experience showed that her fears were not unfounded. In one instance, for example, 2 of his letters got into the wrong hands, and only by pure luck was she able to safely secure them. As a result of this, she wrote, quote, "My fear has almost convinced me not to try to get news in this way again this winter. I also want to tell you that I will no longer throw the letters out of my window because I think it looks too suspicious." End quote. And another excerpt shows very vividly how torn she was between the fear of not seeing him and the fear of being caught. Quote, "I cannot describe the fear that gripped me when I looked out of the window and you were nowhere to be seen. I thought the bright moonlight must have given you away. And as I listened from one window to another and you did not show yourself, my knees began to shake so violently that I could hardly stand. The uncertainty was terrible for me, and I kept thinking that someone would come into the room behind me and I would give myself away, but luckily you came in the end." End quote. And another thing we repeatedly find in the letters are her fears regarding Hölderlin. By early 1800, the small town of Homburg had become too confining for Hölderlin, and he began to make new plans. He wanted to try once again to make a name for himself on the literary scene, and considered moving to Jena or Weimar and founding his own literary magazine. But Susette had reservations. She feared his plans could end up badly, and that his mental and physical health could suffer as a result. And indeed, the planned magazine came to nothing, and all of Hölderlin's other hopes were dashed as well. But apart from her concerns for his mental well-being, she was also afraid of losing him. Every time they saw each other, she was afraid that it might have been the last. Again and again, she kept asking him whether he was really coming, trying to reassure herself. As she wrote, quote, "It wasn't the last time I saw you. No, I can't. I won't think that. Oh, let me hope. Will you come tomorrow, my dear? I believe so, and yet I dare not rely on it. My longing would be too violent if I were to see you no more." End quote. In dark, fatalistic visions, she describes the slow death of their ill-fated love. She wrote, quote, "Everything is black before my eyes, and the most terrible thing would be if our tender love were to suffocate under the harshness of fate, if it were finally to grow dull in our hearts, our lives to be over, and yet a desolate consciousness to remain within us. So many things remain in darkness until our sun shines again. It will return, won't it? O gracious nature, teach me to trust and calm this heart." End quote. And in many cases, the extent of her suffering comes through very strongly. It is heartbreaking to read passages such as these, quote, "I often cry bitter, bitter tears, but it is these tears that sustain me. How melancholy I feel. I want to cry all the time. I long for a response from your kindred spirit. Everything is so lovely, so harmonious, and yet so dead to me, as long as the sign of your existence is missing. I will spend my lonely evenings reading your dear writings, poems, and letters. They will make me shed many loving, invigorating tears, which can only spring from the most precious, faithful, noble love, and which are able to bring blessings to our dreary, everyday life." In October of 1799, the second part of Hölderlin's Hyperion got published, and in early November he was able to hand a copy to Susette in person. The book was accompanied by a letter by Hölderlin in which he wrote, quote, "I give you our Hyperion, my love. I hope that this fruit of our Halcyonian days will bring you some joy. My dearest, everything that is written therein, about us and our love, about the life of our lives. Take it as a thank you, which is often all the more true the more clumsy it is expressed." End quote. This was one of their last rendezvous. In the last few months before their final separation, their meetings started to become less frequent. Both seem to have become increasingly disillusioned. They seem to have realized that things could not go on like this, and appear to have resigned themselves more and more to the inevitable. In her letters, Susette fluctuates between despondency and calm serenity. In one of them she wrote, quote, "I almost have to believe in miracles, because I can't see how we can get back together." End quote. And in some later letters, she just wrote in a very laconic manner, quote, "Come whenever you can. I'll wait for you without anxiety." And so we will think of each other with cheerful fondness and courageously rush toward our reunion with the swift passage of time, whenever that may be. But let me always remain your confidant. End quote. But despite her assurances and resolutions, she couldn't let him go completely. She suggested that they should meet at least once a year, just so they could reassure themselves of each other's well-being. And she expressed the hope that they will never lose each other entirely, and that sometime, someplace, they may find some happiness yet. Quote, "I can never stop believing that we will find us in this world once again, and that we will be happy." End quote. But sadly, the end was near. As far as we know, the last meeting between them seems to have taken place in early May 1800, and the last letters from Susette also date from that time. Unfortunately, we know nothing about their last meeting. I would have loved to know what they talked about and how they said goodbye to each other. Did they suspect that it might be the last time they would see each other? That's rather unlikely. After all, they couldn't have known what the future would hold in store for them. They could not have known what fate would befall both of them. They probably parted ways expecting that they would see each other again at some point in the future. But this was not meant to be. It is quite poetic that the month of May, often associated with spring and with love, saw the beginning as well as the end of their romance. In one of her last letters, Susette wrote, quote, "I cannot write any more. Farewell. You are immortal in my memory." End quote. And in the very last letter, she wrote, quote, "Let us walk our path with confidence and feel happy in our pain, wishing that it may remain with us for a long time to come, because it ennobles us and makes us feel stronger. Farewell, farewell. May blessings be with you." End quote. From that point on, nothing further is known of Susette and how she spent her days. In one of her last letters, she mentioned that her husband had recently bought a country estate near Frankfurt and that she intends to spend a lot of time in the garden there. It had always been one of her dearest wishes to plant trees and create a space of her own, maybe even doing a bit of farming. So we can imagine her living quietly on her estate, tending to her fruit trees and flower beds, shunning Frankfurt society, keeping herself busy, and trying not to think too often about Hölderlin, where he might be, how he is doing, and when she might see him again. As for Hölderlin, he stayed with a friend in Stuttgart for a few months before accepting new positions as private tutor, first in Switzerland in 1801 and then in Bordeaux, France, in 1802. Such a great distance between them was exactly what Susette had feared. Why did she let him go? Why are there no more known letters after May 1800? Hölderlin went abroad with the intention of perhaps never returning to Germany. He wanted to break all ties. He no longer felt comfortable or welcome in Germany. They don't need me, he said, meaning the Germans. But in the end, things turned out quite differently. Both his days in Switzerland and in Bordeaux lasted only a few months. For some reason, Hölderlin couldn't bear to stay any longer. Quite suddenly, and without apparent reason, he left Bordeaux in May 1802 and returned to Germany. This whole journey is shrouded in mystery. We don't know why he left, and we don't know any specific details about his journey because apparently he never spoke about it to anyone. But something must have occurred. Something must have changed within him. There has been some speculation that he might have been robbed somewhere on the road and that maybe he had to fear for his life, because allegedly he hinted at something along those lines. But this is not verified. We must assume, however, that he must have already been in a poor state even before the journey. Because why would he leave Bordeaux so suddenly without any apparent reason? It seems like very erratic behavior. In total, Hölderlin spent almost 2 months on the road. One reason why it took him so long was because he went on foot. He couldn't afford to travel by carriage. But that wasn't the only reason. It seems that he was in no hurry, and that he drifted quite aimlessly, because we do know that he visited Strasbourg and Paris at some point. When he finally arrived in his hometown of Nöttingen, he was in a very bad state. Family and friends were shocked to see what had become of him. Apparently, he had given up on himself. He no longer cared about his appearance. He had grown a beard, didn't tend to his clothes, had long dirty fingernails, and could hardly utter any coherent sentences. It seemed like somewhere on the road, during his wild wanderings, his mind had collapsed. It looks like he had suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. And it would only get worse, because shortly after his return, he received a devastating letter from one of his friends who also happened to know Susette. The friend informed him that she had died quite suddenly on June the 22nd, only a few days before his arrival back home. In his letter, the friend wrote, quote, "The noble object of your love is no more, but she was yours nonetheless. You believed in immortality while she was still alive, and you will surely believe in it now more than ever, since the life of your love has departed from this transitory plane of existence." End quote. Susette had contracted rubella from her children. She must have been infected while caring for them. And whilst her children survived the illness, Susette, who had already been in a weakened state, probably due to tuberculosis, succumbed to it. Her husband, instead of staying with her, had fled to another town. It has been speculated that Hölderlin may have visited her shortly before her death. According to some theories, the reason why Hölderlin had departed from Bordeaux so suddenly was because he had somehow learned of Susette's illness and had rushed to her deathbed to see her one last time. As romantic as that sounds, and as much as I wish it were true, This, however, is rather unlikely, I'm afraid. Because if he had known that Susette was gravely ill, and that there was probably not much time left, he surely would not have taken his time as he did. He would have traveled straight to Frankfurt and not take any detours. But instead, he went to Paris and even took the time to visit an exhibition there, as he wrote in one of his letters. So it saddens me to say that, but most likely he only learned of her illness and her death when it was already too late. I would have been very happy for them if they had been able to say goodbye to each other. Him holding her while she is dying in his arms, like Heathcliff and Catherine in Wuthering Heights. It is very difficult to imagine how he must have felt when he learned of her death, especially considering his already fragile state at that time. He had just returned from a long, arduous journey. All of his plans to establish himself on the literary scene had failed. His hopes of becoming a lecturer in Greek literature at the University of Vienna, as well as his ambition of founding his own literary journal, had come to nothing. Only a handful of his poems had been published. His novel Hyperion did get published, but went mostly unnoticed. And many works that he had set out to write stayed fragmentary and unfinished. He had nothing to show, no hopes left. All of this must have had a devastating effect on his mental state. It was more than his inherently sensitive nature could bear. His mind, as well as his whole existence, lay in ruins. He was a broken man. With Susette, he had lost what he had valued most in life. And to make matters worse, he couldn't even mourn her in peace. Instead, he had to endure his mother's accusations. For it seems that somehow his mother must have found out about his relationship with Susette. And his mother, being a very conservative woman, must have reproached him for having an illicit affair with a married woman. According to some sources, his mother had gone through Hölderlin's belongings and had found Susette's letters. And it is said that when Hölderlin found out about it, he threw his mother out of the house in a fit of rage. These kinds of tantrums were to become more and more frequent. Hölderlin's behavior became extremely erratic, and he developed more and more signs of a chronic mental illness. His condition would alternate between calm, lucid states and violent, agitated fits. For a while he would continue living with his mother, which probably only contributed to making his condition even worse. For months he locked himself in his room and became a virtual recluse. Finally, in 1806, he was admitted to a mental hospital against his will, and the whole ordeal seems to have been highly traumatizing for him. So if he had not been totally broken and traumatized before he entered that asylum, the efforts of the doctors made sure that he finally lost the last bit of his sanity. After several months he was deemed incurable, and, lucky for him, a good-natured carpenter named Zimmer, who was a fan of his Hyperion, rescued him from that horrible place and gave him a new home. From 1807 until his death in 1843, he would live in a tower that was part of the carpenter's property in Tübingen. And today, this very tower is called the Hölderlin Tower. I have already spoken about his illness and his time in the tower in my other Hölderlin video, so I won't go into any more detail about that now. If you're interested in learning more about Hölderlin and his life and his illness, then you can either click on the link in the description or on the one that's appearing in the right-hand corner now. There are only two more things I want to mention, and they are both connected to Susette. During all those years in the tower, Hölderlin almost never spoke about his former life. Whenever he was asked by people about his life or his work, he always responded by babbling some incoherent, evasive platitudes and pleasantries as some sort of protective mechanism. His psyche prevented him from touching these subjects, most likely because they were too painful for him. But once, only once, one of his visitors managed to get an extraordinary answer when he dared to ask him about Susette. Allegedly, Hölderlin responded, quote, "Oh, my Diotima, don't talk to me about my Diotima. She bore me 13 sons. One is Pope, another is Sultan, the third is Emperor of Russia. And do you know what became of her? She went mad." End quote. And lastly, there is one more touching little anecdote I would like to share with you. During the 36 years he spent in this tower, Hölderlin never tried to leave and never expressed a desire to go anywhere or to see anybody. Except once. Sometime in the 1820s, he suddenly felt the urge to go to Frankfurt. And Frankfurt, of course, meant Susette. What else could he have wanted there? She was the only good thing that had happened to him there, that had tied him to this place for 4.5 years. Did he believe her to be still alive? Did he hope to find her standing at her window, waiting for him with great anticipation, just like she used to? Or did he maybe intend to visit her grave? We will never know, because he never made it out of his tower. They stopped him from leaving by taking his boots from him. And apparently he was so upset that he didn't leave his bed for several days. And with that, we come to the end of part 2. Now, the story may be over, both lovers are dead and buried, but there are a few more things I would like to add. Especially, I would like to talk about just why this love story is so special to me and why it touches me so very deeply. So I hope you join me for part 3. Until then, I say good night out there, whoever, whatever, and wherever you may be. Bye-bye.